Lihe, Ravine on a cold evening. White foxes howl at mountain wind beneath the moon. Its autumn cold sweeps up clouds and leaves a sapphire void. Jade mists shimmering, wet, are white as curtains. The silver channel's arsing swell flows to the eastern sky. By the stream, a sleeping egret dreams of migrating geese. Faint ripples without a murmur drift slowly by. Twisting cliffs of layered hills, dragons coil on coil. Bitter bamboos sound for a stranger their sighing flutes. So we continue with yet another poem by Li Hei. This is a translation of Maureen Roberts, I think. So what can we say about this poem? So this is a descriptive landscape poem that appears to be the topic. It describes a ravine, therefore a place between hills, between mountains, a low-lying land, on a cold evening, and the poem clearly establishes the seasonality as being autumn, although cold evening in the title would already be hinting at autumn, if not winter. So, landscape poem, seasonal poem. This poem matches very well with one of the statements in Li Hei's previous poem, Answering My Man Pa, in which Li Hei was represented as the man whose absence would mean that autumn would go unsung. And this is precisely a poem singing about a melancholy, sad landscape in autumn. So one thing that is pretty conventional in this poem is that, remember, autumn is the elegant season for classical Chinese poetry, and most of the poems of scholar officials that talk about sadness, or a big chunk of them, are situated in autumn, because that's the season that resonates with the sadness and melancholy of the human condition, because it's also a season of natural decay and of creeping cold. So from that point of view, it's a very conventional poem. The fact that it includes a lot of images of nature which feel a bit juxtaposed, not specifically ordered in a very clear progressive ordering or with any specific meaning except the general tone of sadness and coldness, that would make it similar to many other Chinese poems. I imagine one of the Li Hei characteristics can be seen from the beginning, that is the image of the white foxes. So white foxes are a mythological creature in Chinese lore. They are associated with spirits, with wicked or at the very least mischievous spirits. And this liking for supernatural images and supernatural elements, the ghostly, the phantasmagoric, is pretty characteristic of Li Hei. In fact, one of the poems we will be reading in a few weeks' time is a poem of his set in a cemetery. So that's very characteristic, or at least stereotypically characteristic of Li Hei. The rich imagery also, well, the sad melancholy, the relentlessly melancholy tone of the images, that's okay, that's more conventional if you wish. Okay, so having said these things, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. The poem is the standard regulated poem, I imagine. White foxes howl, mountain wind, under moon. Probably in the original, it's probably a heptasyllabic regulated poem, Lu Shi. You can see the parallelism pretty clearly in the two central couplets. And again, I'm speculating, but I imagine the syllables here, like white foxes howl, mountain wind, under moon. That would be 7 syllables. So it's probably a heptasyllabic poem. And the whole poem is pretty descriptive, and it's a continuous piece. Perhaps you could make a difference in that the first 2 couplets have more like heavenly images of the sky, of the elevated, of the upper, part of the cosmos, whereas the images in the third and fourth couplets are more down to earth. They're more, they include plants and animals, mountains. They're more earthly images. But that would be a very slight difference I would establish within this poem. So first couplet. White foxes howl at mountain wind beneath the moon. Its autumn cold sweeps up clouds and leaves a sapphire void. So the first image, the image or the set of images used in the first couplet are very, very visual. You can picture this very easily. Like you can imagine a painting with a couple of white foxes, one left, one right, howling, and up and in the middle, the moon, and in between, you could make some ripples representing the mountain wind. So we are outside of the civilized realm. We're in some mountain. There's mountain wind. The moon is illuminating. The moon, generally associated with autumn, and the white foxes are howling. So it's a very visual image, but the poem is transmitting an oral impression, the howl of these supernatural spirits at the moon. And the second line continues with the wind. The wind is the protagonist. The foxes are howling not to the moon, they're howling to the wind, which is the harbinger of cold. And that wind is active. So you have images of activity. The foxes howling and the clouds, the wind sweeping the clouds. And the foxes howling at the wind under the moon, a visual image, and the mountain wind with its cold pushing away the clouds and leaving also a visual image, the sapphire void, which is as beautiful, although different as the shining disk of the moon. So images of activity and movement. The foxes are howling, and in the second line, this mountain wind with its autumn cold, so the season is clearly established and the coolness is reinforced, sweeps up clouds, so it pushes the clouds away, and the empty void, the heavenly void, which is like a sapphire, is all that remains. So that emptiness also transmits coolness. And this is the heavenly backdrop. Second couplet. Jade mists shimmering wet are white as curtains. The silver channel's arsing swell flows to the eastern sky. So in the first couplet we had the foxes howling and the wind pushing. In the second couplet we have two objects. We have the jade mists and the silver channel, which is a fancy way of referring to the river of heaven or the Milky Way. So still high, we're still in the heavenly sphere. And so you have jade mists, so shiny, brilliant mists, and they're shimmering wet, and they are white as curtains. So probably they're white because they are frosty or dewy. Because this is a cold night in autumn, frost must have fallen, and these mists feel shiny, wet and shiny. And they're like curtains. So the only element here through the metaphor that points towards the human or the household realm. So the jade mist shimmering white, they feel like a natural curtain blanketing the scene in the shiny, shimmery, wet white. And up in the sky, the silver channel swell flows to the eastern sky. So this gives us also a slight image of mobility. The curtains seem to close in onto this cold autumn scene, but then the Milky Way with its flow eastwards transmits this sense of movement, but also coldness and whiteness and shininess. Like we might imagine the silver channel of the Milky Way is also white like the curtains and is also shimmering. And you have the parallel images, the jade mist and the silver channel, shimmering, arsing. White curtains, eastern sky. So quite a clear parallelism. Next couplet. So the next couplet, as I said, is also a parallelistic one, but it brings us more down to earth, to images closer than the heavens and the mists rising and enshrouding the sky. By the stream, a sleeping egret dreams of migrating geese. Faint ripples, without a murmur, drift slowly by. So now we have images that denote silence, as opposed to the first couplet, whose images tended to connote movement and perhaps some degree of sound. So we have a sleeping egret by the river. The water is essential in this couplet because we have the egret next to the stream, and then we have the ripples on that self-same stream. So what is the egret doing? It's by the stream, and the poet tells us it's dreaming of migrating geese. This dreaming of the egret and the image he's dreaming, birds migrating, connects us with autumn, as geese are one of the stereotypical elements of autumn. Instead of real geese appearing, though, they appear in this oblique way through the dreaming of the egret. And I imagine this also is a slightly convoluted and probably very Lee Hay-like image. Like, instead of really depicting geese flowing across the sky migrating, you depict them in a dream within the poem, in the presumed dream of the egret. Faint ripples, without a murmur, drift slowly by. Just like the silver channel was flowing in the previous couplet, here this non-silver channel, this real earthly stream, is also flowing quietly and slowly, with very, very faint ripples. Yeah? It's an image of movement, but it's very light movement. And, well, this connects perhaps with the unmovingness, the stillness of the egret by the stream, who is sleeping and therefore not moving. The only movement is in his mind, in his dream of the migrating geese. Finally, the last couplet: twisting cliffs of layered hills, dragons coil on coil. Bitter bamboo sound for a stranger, their sighing flutes. So, we have another couplet which depicts two elements, earthly here, the cliffs and the bamboo. It's interesting because a lot of these couplets, one of the elements points towards the oral, the sound dimension, and the other doesn't. So here, the second line, it's the bitter bamboos, who were a type of bamboo that were used for making some flutes. They are pointing at the sound element, just as in the previous couplet, the ripples were pointing at the sound element, even if it was a lack of sound. And in the first couplet, the wild foxes howling were pointing at that sound element as well. Not in all the couplets, but in a lot of them you have an image associated with sound and an image that is purely visual. So here the purely visual element is in the first line of the fourth couplet. You have twisting cliffs. That twisting seems to also transmit a certain movement. Twisting cliffs of layered hills. And this is a pure metaphor. They're associated with dragons coil on coil. And this is a pretty conventional metaphor. It's also a way of bringing the animals here, because the previous couplet was quite populated with animals, and the first couplet was also populated with the foxes. So here you get dragons, but they're sleeping dragons, and they are metaphorical dragons, like the cliffs, the earthly cliffs that are winding around, twisting around, layer upon layer. They're like dragons coiled and sleeping. And finally, we have that last sound, the bitter bamboo sound for a stranger, their sighing flutes. So we might imagine that there might be a very light wind. It might shake the bamboos and make some sound, although the bamboos would have been used for making a flute. But this is like a natural sound produced by the bamboos for the stranger. Who's the stranger? The poet, the wanderer. Well, that's a pretty stereotypical image, which sometimes intrudes in landscape poems of the Chinese scholar officials. There's a wanderer or a stranger who is passing by, feeling lonely, and who's contemplating the lonely scene, which matches his personal and psychological state. So the bitter bamboos sound a sigh for the stranger. So as I said, the poem is, or the feels as a juxtaposition of different couplets, which are not that well connected, except perhaps for those global associations of first two couplets, heavenly realm, second pair of couplets, the earthly realm, couplets that also seem to be having animals and sound, Not all of them. I think they're the exception is the second couplet. But all the other couplets seem to have one line that focuses on sound and another that is purely visual, and one line that includes some reference to some animal, and another line, well, mythological or real. The dragons and the white foxes would be mythological, and another line that does not focus on animals, in some cases focusing on natural phenomena or on heavenly phenomena or on like Milky Way, clouds, wind, or bamboo sound. So a juxtaposition of images meant to denote the coldness, physical but also psychological coldness of an evening in a ravine outside from areas of human habitation. And it's a melancholy sad poem that again matches the melancholy sad stereotypical persona of Li Hei, the unsuccessful genius and scholar official.